I used to think the scariest thing in the world was being alone. I didn't realize how much worse it was to be married and still feel completely stranded. When I look back now, I can pinpoint the moment my life quietly narrowed, when my world shrank down to the walls of our house and the balance of our joint checking account. At the time, it felt like love. It felt like security. It felt like I was being taken care of. I didn't know I was stepping into a cage I wouldn't notice until the door slammed shut behind me. I met Ryan when I was 26, fresh out of a messy breakup and still trying to pretend I wasn't terrified of my own future. We met at a friend's birthday thing at a brewery downtown. He had this calm, grounded energy that made everyone else seem loud and frantic by comparison. He asked thoughtful questions. He listened without waiting for his turn to talk. When he laughed, it was slow and genuine, like he was actually surprised by joy. I remember thinking, this is what stability looks like. He worked in finance, not flashy Wall Street stuff, just a solid job with a regional firm. He wore clean button-downs, drove a sensible car, and talked about retirement accounts like it was normal dinner conversation. After dating musicians and entrepreneurs who were always 1 month away from greatness, Ryan felt like relief, like exhaling after holding your breath for too long. I was working in marketing then. Nothing glamorous, but I paid my rent, covered my bills, and still had enough left to meet friends for drinks or book a last-minute flight if I needed to feel alive. When Ryan and I moved in together, it felt like a partnership. We split groceries, we split utilities. We joked about how grown up we were becoming. The shift was gradual, almost polite. Ryan got a promotion, bigger paycheck, longer hours, more responsibility. I was proud of him. I bragged about him. When my job started cutting back after a company restructure, it seemed logical for me to take on more of the home stuff. Just for now, we said. I'd handle errands, cooking, scheduling. He'd focus on work. We were a team. Then my position was eliminated entirely. It wasn't dramatic, no confrontation, no tears in the HR office, just a calm meeting and a severance packet. Ryan hugged me when I told him. He said we'd be fine. He said this could be a chance for me to figure out what I really wanted. He said he had us covered. I believed him. I trusted him. And I let go of something I didn't realize I'd need so badly later, my own money. At first, it felt like a break. I slept in, I cleaned the apartment until it looked staged for a listing, I tried new recipes. I told myself I was job searching, but days slipped by, weeks. Ryan never pressured me. He'd transfer money into our joint account like clockwork. He'd say things like, "Don't stress, I've got it." I started to feel grateful in a way that made me smaller. When we got married, the conversation about finances felt like a formality. Of course we'd combine everything. We were married. That's what people did. Ryan handled the accounts. He was better at it. Numbers made him happy. Spreadsheets relaxed him. I signed where he told me to sign and told myself this was trust, not laziness. By the time I noticed how little access I actually had, it already felt too late to question it without sounding ungrateful. I had a debit card. I could buy groceries, clothes, gas, but I didn't know passwords. I didn't know balances. I didn't know where everything went. If I asked, Ryan would explain in broad strokes, reassuring me without really answering. I told myself I didn't need details. I told myself love wasn't about control. Our days fell into a pattern. Ryan left early. I stayed home. Sometimes I'd scroll job boards, but the longer I stayed out of the workforce, the more intimidating it felt to go back. My confidence thinned out. I started measuring my worth by how smooth his life felt when he came home. Dinner ready, house quiet, no complaints. Ryan started traveling more for work. Conferences, client meetings, overnight trips that blurred together. I'd help him pack. I'd kiss him goodbye. I'd wave from the doorway like a wife in a movie I didn't remember auditioning for. I missed him, but I also felt oddly relieved when he was gone. The house felt lighter without the pressure of being good all the time. The first weird moment was small enough to dismiss. I was folding laundry when his phone buzzed on the bed. I wasn't snooping. It was right there. The name on the screen wasn't one I recognized, just a first name, a woman's name. I told myself it was a coworker. Of course it was. I didn't open it. I didn't mention it. I wanted to be the kind of wife who didn't jump at shadows. But shadows have a way of multiplying when you're not looking directly at them. Ryan became more protective of his phone. Not obviously, not in a way you could call out without sounding paranoid. He just always had it on him. Bathroom, shower, quick run to the garage, face down on the table, silent at night. I noticed. I hated myself for noticing.
One night, while he was out of town, I realized I needed to transfer money to cover a credit card bill that was in my name. I logged into the joint account the way I always did, using the one login he'd set up for me. The balance was lower than I expected. Not alarming, but confusing. There were transfers I didn't recognize, withdrawals that didn't line up with our normal spending. My stomach tightened in a way that felt familiar, like the beginning of bad news. I told myself there was an explanation. There always was. But for the first time, it occurred to me that I couldn't verify anything without him. I was financially dependent in a way that suddenly felt dangerous. When I asked him about it, casually, like it didn't matter, he smiled and kissed my forehead. He said he'd moved some money around for tax reasons. He said it was boring stuff. He said I didn't need to worry about it. And I nodded, because I didn't know how to push without sounding like I didn't trust him. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of a house that wasn't really mine. I tried to imagine what I'd do if something went wrong, where I'd go, how I'd leave. The answers were hazy and unconvincing. I didn't like the version of myself that needed him this much. I wish I could say I confronted him then. I wish I could say I demanded transparency or insisted on independence. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of rocking the boat. Scared of discovering something I wouldn't be able to afford to escape. So I stayed quiet. I stayed dependent. And I stayed blind, even as the cracks started to widen. I didn't know yet that Ryan wasn't just hiding numbers from me. He was hiding an entire life. And the longer I stayed financially trapped inside the one he gave me, the harder it became to imagine surviving the truth when it finally broke through. The thing about being financially dependent is that it messes with your sense of reality. Every instinct you have to protect yourself gets filtered through a quiet calculation of risk. Not emotional risk, practical risk. Rent, health insurance, groceries, gas. If I pushed too hard, if I uncovered something I couldn't unsee, what then? That question sat in the back of my mind every time Ryan smiled at me like nothing was wrong.
After that night with the weird transfers, I started paying closer attention. Not in a dramatic, movie-style way. I didn't suddenly turn into a detective. It was subtler than that. I listened differently. I noticed what he didn't say. When he talked about work trips, the details were vague. Same cities over and over, same hotels, same generic stories about dinners with clients that all sounded identical. He started coming home with small changes. New shirts that didn't look like his usual style, a different cologne. Nothing outrageous, just enough to register as unfamiliar. When I'd ask about it, he'd shrug and say he grabbed something on sale or that a client had recommended the scent. He was always prepared with an answer that made me feel silly for even wondering. The loneliness crept in quietly. I was home all day, most days. Friends were at work. My parents lived a few states away. Ryan was gone more often than he was present, and when he was home, he seemed distracted. Not distant exactly, more like his attention was divided, pulled somewhere else I couldn't see. I tried to talk to him about how I was feeling, not accusing, just honest. I told him I felt disconnected. I told him I felt like I'd lost myself a bit. He listened. He nodded. He hugged me. He said things would settle down after the next quarter, after the next project, after the next trip. There was always a future version of us where things were better. The real shift happened the afternoon I ran into someone who wasn't supposed to know me. I was at a coffee shop near our place, killing time before a dentist appointment. I had my laptop open, pretending to look productive. A woman walked in and ordered at the counter, laughing with the barista like she'd been there 100 times. She turned, scanned the room, and her eyes landed on me. She froze. Just for a second, but it was long enough. She walked over slowly, like she was trying to decide if she was imagining things. "Hey," she said, hesitant. "Do you know Ryan?" My heart slammed so hard I felt dizzy. There are a lot of Ryans in the world, but something in her tone told me this wasn't a coincidence. "Yes," I said. "He's my husband." Her face drained of color. She sat down without asking. She looked genuinely shocked, not guilty. That was the part that scared me most. "Oh," she said. "I didn't know he was married." I remember staring at her hands. She was wearing a ring, not a wedding ring, something delicate, intentional. She kept twisting it around her finger like she was trying to ground herself. She told me her name. She told me she'd been seeing Ryan for almost a year. She said he told her he was divorced, that he lived alone, that he traveled for work but was looking to settle down again. She showed me pictures, selfies of them in hotel rooms, smiling, comfortable, intimate without being explicit.
I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I felt like my body had gone numb to protect itself. I asked questions like I was interviewing a stranger about someone else's life. Cities. Dates. How often? Everything lined up perfectly with his trips. She apologized over and over. She looked horrified. She said she would have never gotten involved if she'd known. I believed her. She seemed as blindsided as I was. When she left, I sat there for a long time, staring at my coffee as it went cold. The world outside the window kept moving. People walked past, laughing, texting, living lives that suddenly felt impossible to relate to. I remember thinking, I don't know how to go home. But I did. I always did. Ryan came back from his trip 2 days later. I waited until after dinner. I waited until the house was quiet. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. I told him I knew. I told him I'd met her. I watched his face carefully, waiting for the denial, the anger, the gaslighting. Instead, he went very still. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize right away either. He sat down and put his head in his hands like he was exhausted by the truth finally being out. That somehow made it worse. He said it wasn't supposed to happen. He said it started as something casual, something that made him feel wanted again. He said it didn't mean he didn't love me. He said it was complicated. I asked him how he could afford hotel rooms, gifts, dinners, flights, without me noticing. He hesitated. Then he admitted he'd opened a separate account years ago. Money I didn't know about. Money I had no access to. He said he needed freedom. He said it like that word was supposed to explain everything. That was the moment it hit me how trapped I really was. He hadn't just cheated on me emotionally or physically. He'd structured our entire life so that I couldn't easily leave him. My dependence wasn't an accident. It was a feature. I told him I needed space. He nodded. He said he understood. But when I asked how I was supposed to leave without money, without a job, without anywhere to go, he didn't have an answer. He offered to help, to give me an allowance while I figured things out. The word made me feel sick. That night, I slept on the couch. I stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine a version of my life that didn't include him controlling the ground under my feet. I thought about all the times I'd ignored my instincts because it was easier, because it was safer, because I didn't think I had a choice. In the days that followed, Ryan acted like a man trying to manage damage, not repair trust. He was careful, polite, almost businesslike. He avoided emotion. He talked about logistics, therapy, boundaries, what made sense financially. Every conversation reminded me that he was still holding all the cards. I started quietly preparing, updating my resume, reaching out to old contacts, Googling apartments I couldn't afford. I didn't tell him any of it. I didn't trust him with my plans anymore. The betrayal hurt. Of course it did. But the deeper wound was realizing how easily he'd compartmentalized me. Wife at home, girlfriend on the road, provider in control. He built a double life on the assumption that I wouldn't notice, because I couldn't afford to question him. And as angry as I was, as broken as I felt, I also knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. I wasn't ready to stay trapped inside the aftermath of his choices. Even if it meant starting over from nothing, I needed a way out. I just didn't know yet how high the cost of that freedom was going to be. Once you know the truth, the air in your house changes. Every sound gets louder. Every silence feels loaded. I started noticing how carefully Ryan moved around me, like I was something fragile he didn't want to shatter further, or maybe something volatile he didn't want to provoke. He spoke softly. He asked before touching me. He slept in the guest room without being asked. From the outside, it might have looked like respect. From the inside, it felt like control rebranded as courtesy. I stopped telling him anything that mattered. During the day, while he was at work, I turned into a different version of myself. Quiet. Strategic. I treated my life like a problem that needed solving, not a tragedy that needed mourning. I updated my resume line by line, cringing at how thin it looked after years out of the workforce. I sent emails I was embarrassed to write, reconnecting with people I hadn't spoken to since before my wedding. I told them I'd taken time off for family reasons.
I kept the truth vague because I wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Every rejection hit harder than it should have. We're looking for someone with more recent experience, we've decided to move forward with another candidate. I read between the lines and heard what they weren't saying. You're behind. You're rusty. You're a risk. It confirmed my worst fear. Ryan hadn't just cheated on me. He'd let me atrophy. Money became a constant low-level panic. I checked the joint account more often now, memorizing numbers like they were clues. Ryan continued transferring money in regularly, like a paycheck. It was generous enough to keep me comfortable, not generous enough to feel free. I hated that I needed it. I hated that he knew I needed it. One night, after a particularly brutal day of job hunting, I asked him how long he'd been planning to leave me dependent. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I just asked. He looked genuinely confused, offended even. He said he'd never planned that. He said things had just evolved that way. He said I could have gotten a job anytime I wanted. The words landed like a slap. As if confidence grows in isolation. As if years of subtle dependence don't change the way you see yourself. I realized then that Ryan and I were living in two completely different realities. In his version, he was a provider who'd made a mistake. In mine, he was a man who'd quietly rearranged my life so that his betrayal would be survivable for him and devastating for me. A week later, I got a message from her again. The woman from the coffee shop. She asked if I was okay. I almost didn't respond. It felt dangerous, like touching a live wire. But I did. We met again, this time at a park, sitting on opposite ends of a bench like two people sharing a secret they didn't ask for. She told me things I hadn't known yet, about how Ryan talked about me, how he said our marriage was comfortable but empty, how he claimed we were more like roommates, how he said I didn't need him the way she did. I listened without interrupting, even when it felt like my chest was caving in. The most painful part wasn't the sex or the lies. It was realizing how carefully he'd curated his image for both of us. With me, he was the dependable husband carrying the weight of our life. With her, he was the misunderstood man craving connection. He got to be the victim in every version. She told me she'd ended things with him immediately. She said she felt used. I believed her. We sat there in silence for a while, two women connected by the same man's duplicity, neither of us quite knowing what to do with that bond. When I got home, Ryan asked where I'd been. I said I'd gone for a walk. It was the first lie I told him that felt intentional, protective, mine. The more distance I created emotionally, the more he tried to pull me back in with practicality. He suggested we see a financial planner together. He talked about post-nuptial agreements, about fairness. He framed everything as reasonable adult conversations, but every plan still centered him as the gatekeeper. I consulted a lawyer without telling him. It felt surreal, sitting in that office, explaining my marriage like a case study. The lawyer listened carefully, then told me the truth I'd been avoiding. Yes, I was entitled to marital assets. No, it wouldn't be fast or easy. Yes, my lack of income would matter. Yes, I should start documenting everything immediately. I went home and cried harder than I had since the confrontation, not because of Ryan, because of myself, because I'd let my independence erode slowly enough that I hadn't noticed until it was almost gone. Things escalated the night I told Ryan I was thinking about separation, not divorce, just separation, space. He didn't yell. He didn't beg. He got cold. He asked how I planned to support myself. He asked where I planned to live. He reminded me of health insurance, of car payments, of how expensive everything was. He wasn't threatening. He was stating facts. That was worse. I told him I'd figure it out. My voice didn't sound convincing even to me. After that, the money changed. Subtly. Transfers came later, smaller. When I asked, he said he was tightening things up in case we separated. He said it was responsible. I heard the message underneath. You don't move without my permission. That night, I packed a bag and drove to a friend's place without telling him. I needed to feel what it was like to leave, even temporarily. The relief was immediate and crushing at the same time. I slept on her couch and cried into a pillow so I wouldn't wake her. I felt free and terrified in equal measure. The next morning, I checked my bank account. The joint account was still there. My card still worked, but something had shifted inside me. I knew now that staying was a slow death. Leaving would hurt, but it would hurt forward. Ryan texted me dozens of times, calm messages, concerned messages, then irritating ones. He asked when he was coming home. He said we needed to talk. He said we shouldn't make decisions out of emotion. I didn't respond right away. For the first time in years, my silence wasn't fear, it was choice. I didn't know how this was going to end yet. I didn't know how ugly it might get, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity.
His double life had only worked because I'd been financially trapped inside the one he let me see. And I was done living in a story where my survival depended on his permission. Leaving didn't feel dramatic the way people imagine it does. There was no suitcase by the door, no final speech. It felt quiet and procedural, like shutting down a life one practical step at a time. I stayed on my friend's couch for 3 weeks, long enough for the adrenaline to wear off and the reality to sink in. I rotated through the same 3 outfits. I brushed my teeth with a borrowed toothbrush. I tried not to think about how quickly my sense of ownership over anything had disappeared. Ryan oscillated between apology and strategy. Some days he'd text paragraphs about regret, about how he'd lost himself, about wanting to fix things. Other days he'd switch to logistics, asking when I planned to pick up more clothes, reminding me of upcoming bills, telling me we needed to handle this like adults. Every message carried the same undertone. He still believed he was in charge. The lawyer helped me see it more clearly. She explained how financial control doesn't have to be loud to be effective, how dependency can be built through comfort, not cruelty. She told me I wasn't stupid. She told me this happened more often than people admit. I clung to that reassurance like a life raft. We filed for separation first. It was a line in the sand I needed before I could even say the word divorce. Ryan didn't fight it, not openly. He agreed to temporary support. On paper it looked fair. In practice it still felt like allowance, still felt like asking permission to breathe. The hardest part wasn't losing him. It was losing the version of myself who believed love automatically meant safety. I replayed moments from our marriage with new clarity. The way he'd insisted on handling finances to reduce stress. The way he'd framed my working less as a luxury he was giving me. The way he'd subtly discouraged me from taking freelance projects because it wasn't worth the hassle. None of it had seemed sinister at the time. That was the point.
I finally moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city. It was loud and imperfect, and mine. The floors creaked, the neighbors argued, the rent made my stomach twist every month. I slept on a mattress on the floor for weeks. I cried the first night there, overwhelmed by the silence and the freedom. I cried the second night too. By the third night, I slept like someone who didn't have to listen for another person's footsteps. I took a job I was overqualified for and underpaid at. It bruised my ego, but it gave me a paycheck with my name on it. The first time I paid rent entirely on my own, I sat on the kitchen floor and laughed until it turned into sobbing. Independence didn't feel empowering at first. It felt exhausting, but it was honest. Ryan struggled more than he let on. Without me managing the invisible parts of his life, things fell apart faster than I expected. He missed deadlines, he forgot appointments, he complained about how hard everything felt now. He tried to lean on me emotionally, like I was still his anchor. I stopped responding to those messages. I wasn't cruel. I was done. The divorce process dragged on. There were arguments about assets I didn't even know existed until they showed up in documents, accounts, investments, money that had flowed through our marriage without ever touching my hands. Each discovery hurt, not because of the money itself, but because of how thoroughly I'd been excluded from the truth. The woman from the coffee shop faded out of my life naturally. We exchanged a few messages over the months, checking in, sharing updates. Eventually, we didn't need each other anymore. The bond had done its work. It had shown us we weren't crazy. On the day the divorce was finalized, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt quiet. I went back to my apartment and sat on the couch and stared at the wall. The marriage that had once felt like my entire future was now a stack of signed papers and a closed chapter. I didn't celebrate. I breathed. It took time to rebuild my confidence, to stop second-guessing my instincts, to trust my own judgment again. I went to therapy. I talked about money more openly than I ever had before. I learned how to manage my own accounts, my own plans, my own safety net. It wasn't glamorous. It was necessary. People asked if I missed him. Sometimes I did. I missed the early version of us, the one that felt equal. But I didn't miss the power imbalance. I didn't miss the anxiety of not knowing where I stood. I didn't miss living in a house where love came with conditions I didn't understand until it was almost too late. Ryan tried to reconnect months later. He said he'd changed. He said he understood what he'd done wrong now. I believed he believed that. I also knew it didn't matter. Understanding after the damage is still too late. What stayed with me wasn't just the betrayal. It was the lesson carved into my bones about autonomy, about how love without independence isn't safety, it's risk, about how easily comfort can turn into captivity if you stop paying attention. I tell my story now not because it's unique, but because it's common and quiet and easy to miss while you're living it. I didn't leave with nothing. I left with myself. That had to be enough. It was. It is.